Okay, guys, how you doing? We're going to go ahead and get started with the lecture today on the growth of nationalism in a couple of regions, particularly following World War One. So we're going to focus on kind of some important movements with nationalism across places in Asia, some in Africa, and some in Latin America. So we'll go ahead and jump right into that. You should have your notes outlined to go through as we're doing this. As always, you're going to fill in the missing information and complete your outline as I go through this here, okay? So just a quick overview, a little context, as we like to call it here in AP World History. When we get to the end of World War One, as we've been discussing in class, the Treaty of Versailles and all those things that ended it, we're going to see a bunch of challenges brought about to the imperialism that had been established during the late 1800s, early 1900s by the Europeans. You know, we've established the colonization of Africa and the so-called scramble for Africa. We have areas of Asia under control of Europeans. And then, of course, Latin America was under a lot of economic control and sort of influence, particularly from the United States. So as we bring about the end of World War I, we're going to see those things challenged. And then, of course, the Great Depression is going to really start to shape a lot of the events of the world beginning in the late 1920s, particularly through the 1930s. And this is going to help gain some strength, add some credibility to some of these nationalist movements that are going to challenge the European control and the European domination. So we're kind of going to go through this region by region, looking at some different areas and kind of how nationalism plays a role there. So let's start over in Asia. I'm sorry, I'm going to backtrack here a little bit. We need to start in the Middle East on this particular one with what's called the mandate system. And it was mentioned in class briefly, but one of the things that happened at the end of World War I was that the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and out of it, the newly established League of Nations that was created at the insistence of Woodrow Wilson is going to establish what we call a mandate system. Now, this is going to be adopted for, the Ottoman Empire and the German colonies at the end of the war. What the mandate system was, the idea was the territories would become mandates or sort of, guided by the Europeans, by the British and the French in particular. And eventually these regions across the Middle East would be granted their independence. That was the plan anyhow, right? So the idea here is, we have these different areas in the post-World War II Middle East here, the establishment of Turkey, the French mandate of Syria, the British mandate of Iraq, the British mandate of Palestine, so on and so forth. These mandates are going to end up basically becoming extensions of colonies for the Europeans. So this can have a really long-lasting impact on the areas of the Middle East, particularly in what we call Palestine. Because after World War II, as we'll learn, there's going to be establishment of a new homeland for the Jewish people to return to after the Holocaust and all that sort of stuff happens. And that's going to cause this massive conflict that is literally ongoing to this very day between the Palestinians and then the people who are known as the Israelis, who are the ones who established a new country in the region called Palestine. So we'll backtrack to that, but the mandate system was essentially this extension of European colonization at the end of the Ottoman Empire's existence, where they took over a lot of the regions of the Middle East. So, as I mentioned, now we're going to shift over to Japan, okay? Japan, as we know, beginning in the late 1800s, went through the Meiji Restoration period, really started to improve upon its modernization, its industrialization, goes through this really remarkable rapid industrialization. And because of that, it's looking to build up its national strength. It's looking to build up its national sort of influence in the world. And we're going to start to see in the 20s and 30s this significant buildup of Japanese military expansion, Japanese military political, or the Japanese military machine is going to be built up with this much more powerful military. And the most notable incident happens in 1931. 1931, the Japanese, who are seeking to expand their influence across Asia, are going to basically begin taking an interest in a region of China called Manchuria, northern part of China. So we're looking over here at China. The red islands here, Japan. The Korean Peninsula has already fallen under the control of the Japanese as of 1928. But this area up here called Manchuria, a very natural resource-rich region of China, is going to be taken over by Japan after this incident in 1931 called the Mukden incident, which happens right in this little city here. So what happened in that particular area, this is at a time when China is going through this sort of unification. They're also fighting the Civil War. It's kind of this contradictory thing going on. But what we see happen is that a Japanese railroad line in the area of Mukden is going to be blown up. And the Japanese government is going to blame this particular incident on the Chinese government But what we do know nowadays is that this was a Japanese orchestrated explosion. But the important thing is the Japanese use this as their excuse, their justification for sending their military out of the Korean border here and into the region of Manchuria. This is going to be the first Japanese sort of incursions into the mainland of China. Ultimately, this is going to be one of the contributing factors of World War II. And some historians actually trace back the beginning of World War II, they say it should be back at this time in 1931, because this is really when the fighting begins that we characterize World War II with, okay? So what ends up happening, though, Japan is a member of the League of Nations. And one of the main goals of the League of Nations is to prevent future world conflicts by preventing countries from, invading sovereign regions that have the right to govern themselves. So this is the first true test of the League of Nations power. And the Japanese, like most countries of the world, with the exception of the United States, were part of the League of Nations. And so when they invaded the Mukden, or the Manchuria region after the Mukden incident, the League of Nations condemned them. They said, Japan, you're not allowed to do that. You've signed this agreement. Our charter states you will not do this. Well, the Japanese response is basically to say, well, guess what? We're not going to be part of your little League of Nations anymore. We quit. We're leaving. We're no longer responsible to being held to the standards of what you guys say we need to do. So this is actually an image here. The Japanese very famously pack up all their stuff and walk out of the League of Nations. And a lot of people, again, consider this to be the beginning of the aggression that plays a role in the start of World War II. So I do want to say this about the League of Nations at this point, right? It was weak in several ways. The idea itself was solid, Woodrow Wilson's, but there were two main things that were causing it to be so weak. The first is that the United States never chose to join. The reason the United States didn't join at the end of World War I is, even though it was our president's idea, our government, the sitting senators and Congress people in the United States government, and the American citizenry as a whole had no interest. They said, why would we get involved in an organization that could drag us into another conflict around the world that is not even in our best interest, much like World War I had been. The second reason the League of Nations is so weak is that they actually did not have a military. They had no ability to send in military forces or in any way, pressure through military means countries like Japan for taking action such as they just did here in Manchuria. And what's so notable about this is that in 1931, when this happens and the League of Nations does nothing, this is going to embolden other leaders like Adolf Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy to also ignore the League of Nations and ignore the sort of parameters they set for what is international law. And the Japanese really kind of opened this door for that to happen. So we start to see this growing sense of nationalism in Japan. This is going to be a factor in it as well, because the Japanese are going to want to, sort of show their nation's superiority over others. So now let's shift over to China. Okay, over in China, we have in the year 1911 the final conclusion of the dynastic cycle of Chinese history. The 2,000-year-long tradition of one dynasty rising, falling, another one taking over, finally comes to a conclusion when the Qing dynasty collapses amongst the revolution that takes place there. And what we see happen is the emergence of this man you see on the top right here. His name is Sun Yat-sen. He is an intellectual and educated scholar. And basically, he's going to lead this new nationalist movement to unify China under a much more democratic style government as opposed to the sort of, the empire that it had been for so many centuries and even millenniums, you could say at this point. So one of the notable things that happens, though, under Sun Yat-sen, he devotes China to, full independence from any European influence, rapid industrialization. But in 1919, there's going to be this major movement called the May 4th movement. Many, many, many young Chinese intellectuals, students, begin to they're opposing. They have a lot of opposition to the Chinese government's weakness at the Paris Peace Conference that allowed the Japanese to gain control of, German colonies in China were awarded to the Japanese. They were allowed to, roll into Korea with very little, opposition. So this May 4th movement is like this massive sort of a protest against the Chinese government. And it symbolized kind of China's growing nationalism. It symbolized the demand for democracy there. And it led to a lot of Chinese to begin to start to reject the ideas of these Western-style governments. And many of them start to turn towards Marxism, towards communism as a possible solution. So all this begins happening, and what we see take place is By 1921, two competing groups have emerged in China as kind of the leaders in the Chinese government. One is called the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. They're going to be led by a young peasant by the name of Mao Zedong. He's going to be a huge part of China's history moving forward. And the opposing group is going to be what's called the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party, who were originally followers of Sun Yat-sen. Eventually are going to be led by a guy by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. Okay? And ultimately, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, that was founded in 1921, was based on peasants who are looking to have a more fair distribution of wealth and land across China. And they're going to grow in popularity and power as we begin moving through the 1920s. So when Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the nationalists, the guy who led the end of the Qing dynasty, dies in 1925, a civil war breaks out between the CCP and the Chinese Nationalist Party called the Kuomintang. And by this time, we have Chiang Kai-shek, also known as Yang Jiechi, is going to become the leader of the nationalists. This is Chiang Kai-shek here. Okay. Unlike Sun Yat-sen, he despised the communists. This is Mao Zedong over here, young Mao Zedong, who leads the communists. And ultimately, the Civil War breaks out in 1925. The nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek have a huge advantage. In fact, they begin pushing, if we look across this map here, they begin pushing the Communist Party out of southern China. And in a very famous incident, Mao Zedong is going to lead what's called the Long March as the Chinese communists retreat from southern China into the northern areas of China over the course of 2 years. This is a very brutal retreat. They call it the Long March. About 80,000 communist CCP members left on this. Only about 10,000 survived, including Mao Zedong himself. But what happened is because of this, it brought a lot of popularity and a lot of admiration to Mao Zedong and his CCP army, and the peasants across China began gaining support, or began showing more and more support for the Communist Party of China and less for the nationalists. So we'll revisit this Chinese Civil War as we move into things, but again, we can see this growing sense of nationalism in China. Now, if we shift over to India, it's important to note, India has been a colony under the control of the British since the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion, but after World War I, the expectation by a lot of Indian people were that they were going to be getting their independence. And there was a lot of frustration amongst the population of Indian people when the Paris Peace Settlement came out that did not include colonies such as India getting their independence. The British, rather than being open to the idea of independence for India, actually cracks down on it. They end up passing this act in 1937 called the India Act of 1937 that essentially really limits the power of Indian people within India. And it more or less happens as a result of this 1919 incident called the Amritsar Massacre, right? What happens in the Amritsar Massacre is that many Indian people peacefully are protesting the British government and their abuses of the Indian people, and they're protesting for, Indian independence and nationalism. And the British military opened fires on them, killing about, I think it was like 80 to 100 people died. But it kind of becomes this rallying cry for the Indian people. It leads to this modified self-rule that the British kind of give this facade of providing Indians with their own self-government, but it doesn't really work. And the other challenge we're going to see in India as they're moving towards independence is you have these two different religious groups that kind of dominate India because of historical developments. We have a significant population, the majority of people who are Hindus, long-standing religious tradition of India, and then we have our minority of our Muslims due to the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. So we start to see the Muslims not being very open to the idea of an independent India because they fear they will be minorities in a Hindu-dominated independent India. Well, as time goes on, we're going to see the emergence of two different groups fighting for India's independence, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. A very well-known man by the name of Mohandas Gandhi is going to eventually emerge as the leader of the Indian National Congress. Now, Gandhi, we'll kind of come back to him a little bit as well during class, but fascinating story. Was born into a very wealthy Hindu family, much like many wealthy Hindus and Indian people. He was sent abroad to study, so he actually spent time in London, England, studying law, became a lawyer. And upon getting his law degree, instead of going back to India, he actually went to South Africa, where many Indians had settled as a result of things like, settlement patterns and migrations due to, for work patterns and stuff like that. So anyhow, Gandhi ends up in South Africa for 25 years. He's in South Africa fighting on behalf of the Indian people there for having equal rights. And as he's there, he begins to develop his philosophy that we now call ahimsa. Ahimsa has its roots in Hindu traditions and in a few other religious beliefs across India, but it's basically this idea of nonviolence towards all living things. And using this, Gandhi's going to start to develop his strategies of nonviolent resistance, boycotts, civil disobedience, and all these things that eventually we're going to come back to when he returns to India to lead the nonviolent resistance. So one leader is Mohandas Gandhi of the Indian National Congress. His counterpart of the Muslim League is a man by the name of Muhammad al-Jinnah. Now, Muhammad al-Jinnah is also in favor of India's independence, but what he would like to see is two separate states upon independence, a Hindu state and a Muslim state. And eventually that will take place when the colony of India does gain independence. It's divided into a Hindu country that's set aside, we call it India, and a region that's set aside for the Muslims that is now known as Pakistan. Again, we'll come back and learn more about this stuff, but these images here, this is Gandhi on the left, Muhammad al-Jinnah here on the right. And I put this up here because most people, when they think of Gandhi, he's a very well-known figure. You can probably visualize him in your head. You probably don't see him in his Western-style clothing as a young lawyer in South Africa. Most of us traditionally picture Gandhi in the, wearing his very simply hand-spun cloth clothing, his glasses, his bald. This is a very, much more older version of Gandhi is what most people picture, okay? So, we'll be coming back to India. All right, let's wrap up here with a quick thing about Africa. Much like the colonies in Asia, a lot of Africans participated in World War I because they were colonial control of the Europeans. And after the war, many of the African people felt that self-determination was their right, that they should be able to govern themselves. They fought amongst the Europeans. They fought with them. They helped them win. But the reality is, European imperialists, rather than loosen control, they actually tighten their control of their colonial possessions because, again, Africa as a region is becoming more and more important for world trade. They're exporting so many resources out of Africa from these colonies that it is just, it's too valuable of an opportunity for Europeans to loosen control of. So they're going to tighten their control. But again, as people fall under the rule of foreigners, it leads to these nationalist movements, whether we're talking about in China, whether we're talking about in Africa, whether we're talking about in India. It's a common trend we see, a theme we see over and over. And so what ends up happening in Africa, we start to see this new growing class of intellectuals. They're known as the new African elite. Many of these, much like Gandhi, were African people who had been educated in European universities. Like the guy you see on your screen there, his name is Jomo Kenyatta. He's going to be the guy who eventually founds the independent state or country we call Kenya today. But these African elites start to call for this independence and these new ideas of African identities. They embrace the notion of a nation state as the best model, meaning like you put together the people who have similar ethnic, religious, cultural backgrounds into a nation. And a state, that's the state, the government is kind of reflecting of the people of their different ethnic groups. They say this would be the best model, but there's a lot of differing opinions. How would nations be organized? Many different ethnic groups should be organized along those. Should it be geographical? Should it be languages? Some people, including a man by the name of Marcus Garvey, are even known for calling for what's known as Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism with the idea that all Africans were united into a single nation together. So we're starting to see these competing ideas, these differing ideas, but the ultimate idea is there's a lot of people pushing for independence and the creation of new nation states across Africa. Finally, if we go over to Latin America, Central and South America, we know that they had achieved independence way before all this had happened, well before the age of imperialism in the late 1800s, with their revolutions led by Simón Bolívar and all those different people. But it wasn't like Europeans, and particularly the United States, were going to simply leave them to their own. There's too much value in Latin America. So what we see happen in the late 19th century, the late 19th century especially, is what we call neo-colonialism, what we call the new colonialism across Latin America. And basically what this entails is, a country that is being economically dominated by a foreign power. Oftentimes these countries intervene militarily into the political affairs. This is mostly carried out by Great Britain and the United States, but by definition, neocolonialism is this idea that actions are taken by one country to indirectly control another. So what we're going to see happen are things like, the United States putting in, sometimes using their military force, putting in leaders that could be like puppets for what the United States wanted to see happening in those regions. And that gave a lot of economic control without directly governing over the people in these Latin American countries. We also start to see the United States implement this idea called the good neighbor policy. This is in the 1920s and 30s. The idea was the United States wanted to, as a good neighbor, keep the relationship strong with these countries by training the local military. So instead of actually sending in U.S. troops, we would train the local militias, train the local militaries to protect and sort of, in a lot of ways, enhance our interests in these parts of the world. So there's all sorts of different examples of this happening. We've got, the U.S. intervenes in Nicaragua and Mexico. There's a United Fruit Company, an entire fruit company that is going to kind of start to run certain countries. But ultimately, in the 1800s, the Monroe Doctrine, which basically told everyone to stay out of Central America, that's the United States' interest. We start to see, dollar diplomacy, good neighbor policy. All these things are ways in which the United States is going to have a hand in shaping what happens in Latin America. So that's what we call neocolonialism or new colonialism. So, all right, well, that was a pretty long set of notes there. I went through a lot of details on things that you maybe, don't need to know every single thing about. But what I would recommend, and what you guys also need to do, I'm not going to show this video on the lecture, in the Schoology folder, the Freeman or the Heimler history video for topic 7.5 is posted. You do need to watch it. It's extremely important that you do. It's going to much more concisely give you the main ideas for what you need to know about this, okay? All right, guys, have a good rest of your day.